Lying in a hospital bed after the horrific pipeline explosion at the harbor, I coldly listened to my own son call from a luxurious resort. "Dad, you figure it out yourself. We can't refund the resort. I won't be back until after my vacation." I smiled immediately, ordered all my pension accounts frozen, and secretly contacted a lawyer to overturn the secret will that had been kept secret for 17 years. I wanted to see what he would do when the lucrative prize disappeared. A few hours later, 94 missed calls flooded my phone. This story doesn't rush, neither should we. Before we begin, drop a quick comment and tell me, what are you doing while you listen? Driving, working, just trying to make it through the day. I read every single one. A quick note, some details here are fictionalized for storytelling. The lesson at the heart of it, that's what I hope stays with you. There is a number I want you to hold in your mind while I tell you this story, 94. That's how many missed calls were glowing on my phone screen when I woke up Wednesday morning in Massachusetts General Hospital room 408. 94 calls from the same number. 94 attempts to reach a man lying in a hospital bed with second-degree pressure burns across his left shoulder, a fractured patella, and enough fluid in his lungs that every breath sounded like wet gravel. Not one. I did not answer a single one. The calls started Monday afternoon, 3 hours after the pipeline blew. They came in waves, 5 calls in 10 minutes, then silence, then another burst. By Tuesday evening, the number had climbed past 60. By Wednesday morning, 94. The man calling was on vacation. Ibiza, to be specific. 2 weeks at a resort that costs more per night than most people in Boston make in a month. When the hospital tried to reach him Monday when I was still in the ICU listed as critical, he told them he'd call back after dinner. After dinner? I know this because the nurse Beverly Cooper told me exactly what he'd said. She had 61 years of sharp eyes and zero tolerance for nonsense. And when she repeated his words, her mouth made a shape that told me everything about what she thought of a man who prioritizes resort dining over his father's condition. The call started after he finished his meal. I had a different kind of conversation to prepare for, and I was saving every word of it. "My name is Otis Barnes. I am 68 years old. I have calloused hands that haven't fully straightened in 15 years, and a left shoulder that now carries burn scars the shape of a burst steam valve. I built Harborline Marine Services from a single dilapidated harbor shack. I bought in 1994 for $11,000 I didn't have. 31 years later, Harborline Marine Services is worth $18 million. We do shipping repair, container vessels, commercial fishing boats, private yachts when the owner pays for work done right. 2 dry docks, 43 employees, and a reputation in Boston Harbor that took 3 decades to build and could disappear in 3 minutes if the wrong pipe blew at the wrong time. Monday morning, the wrong pipe blew. But here's what my family knows: the $18 million valuation, the 2 dry docks, the reputation, the paychecks that clear every other Friday without fail since 1996. What they don't know is that I also own 3 private piers in Boston Harbor, $22 million in assets that nobody in my family has ever asked about because nobody except one person has ever spent enough time at the docks to notice which piers carry the Harborline Marine Services name and which ones carry something else. You need to understand what $40 million built from calloused hands actually means in Boston Harbor. It means I was first on site every morning for 28 years. It means I know the name of every welder, every crane operator, every kid who started in the paint shop and worked up to master shipwright. It means that when my wife Murray died 6 years ago, 70 people showed up to her funeral who I hadn't invited, but who came anyway because they remembered her bringing coffee to the docks every Sunday morning. It means I know the difference between a man who builds something and a man who simply expects to inherit it. The phone on my bedside table buzzed again. Call number 95. I watched it vibrate against the white laminate, watched the screen light up with a name I'd given it: Desmond. Desmond Barnes, 41 years old, my son. The man currently in Ibiza who couldn't interrupt his vacation when his father nearly died, but who had found time to call 95 times to ask what this meant for the business. I know that's what he wanted because he'd left voicemails. 14 of them. I listened to 3 before I understood the pattern. "Dad, I heard about the accident. Call me back." "Dad, the hospital said you're stable. I need to know what's happening with the contracts." "Dad, I talked to Ross and he says the insurance adjusters are already on site. We need to discuss the liability exposure." "Not once. Are you okay?" "Not once. I'm coming home. Just the contracts, the insurance, the liability, the business. The business I built. The business he'd spent 15 years treating like a trust fund that simply hadn't matured yet. I let call number 95 go to voicemail. Outside my window, Boston Bay spread out in October gray, the kind of cold, flat light that makes everything look exactly as worn as it actually is. I could see Pier 9 from here if I turned my head far enough, could see the emergency vehicles still parked along the dock. The yellow caution tape, the shape of the investigation still unfolding around a decision I'd made 3 years ago that I knew was wrong when I made it. How does a father spend 36 years pretending he doesn't see the truth right in front of him? I have 2 sons, one by blood and one by everything else. Desmond Barnes, my biological son, born 1984, raised in the house Morel and I bought in 1983. 41 years of private schools and college I paid for, an MBA I funded. 15 years working at Harborline Marine Services in positions that kept getting higher titles and smaller responsibilities. And Noel Barnes, my nephew, my late sister Elena's son. He is 45 years old. When Elena passed away suddenly 36 years ago, she left behind a 9-year-old boy who carried our family name as she had never married. I took him in. He grew up at the docks, starting in the paint shop at 22. He's been there 23 years now. He runs the entire operation, though his title doesn't say that and his paycheck doesn't reflect it. Lying in that hospital bed was the first time in 36 years I stopped pretending there was no difference between the two of them. This is the story of 36 years of a man's quietest failures and the week he finally stopped making them. The accident happened on a Monday afternoon at 4:15, 2 blocks from the pier I'd been inspecting for 31 years. Pier 9. High-pressure steam pipeline feeding the dry dock hydraulic systems. I'd walked that route every Monday since 1994, checking pressure gauges, corrosion points, valve integrity. 31 years of Monday afternoons means I'd made that inspection walk 1,612 times. 1,613 was different. The pipe was old, installed 1987, rated for 25 years, still in service at 38 because I'd signed off on a deferral 3 years ago. The replacement quote came in at $240,000. Desmond said we should wait until the next fiscal quarter when the marine contract renewals came through. I knew waiting was wrong. I signed the deferral anyway because my son had an MBA and used words like fiscal quarter, and I wanted to believe that meant he understood something I didn't. The pipe exploded without warning. 1 second I was checking the gauge reading at junction 7. The next second I was on my back 12 feet away with second-degree pressure burns across my left shoulder and chest, a fractured patella from where I'd hit the concrete piling, and enough superheated steam in my lungs that every breath tasted like blood and metal. I don't remember the ambulance. I remember the ceiling of the emergency room at Massachusetts General Hospital, white acoustic tiles with small holes in a pattern that repeated every 4 tiles. I counted them while a young attending physician who looked like she'd graduated medical school sometime last Thursday explained that my lungs were having what she called a very difficult week. "Your lungs are going through a very difficult week, Mr. Barnes," Dr. Keaton said. She had the calm authority of someone twice her age and the kind of honest eyes that told me she'd already seen the paperwork about the deferred pipeline replacement. "They can join the club," I said, and she made a sound that might have been a laugh if she wasn't so professional. They admitted me that night. Room 408, 4th floor window facing Boston Bay. The same bay Morel used to watch from our kitchen window, the same gray October water that had been there when I bought my first dock and would be there long after I was gone. I made the first call the next morning at 6:30 to Desmond first, because 30 years of habit is a hard thing to break even when you know it's wrong. He answered on the 3rd ring. The background noise came through before his voice did electronic dance music, the kind that costs $200 a bottle to listen to in an Ibiza beach club. Laughter. The clink of glasses. A woman's voice underneath it all, sharp and quick, speaking too quietly for me to make out words, but loud enough to recognize the tone, calculating, urgent, managing. That was Viveka Barnes, 38 years old, Desmond's wife of 6 years, a woman who could make a spreadsheet out of a sunset and usually did. I'd met her 4 times. She'd called me sir at our first meeting, and Mr. Barnes ever since, the kind of formal distance that feels like a moat. "Dad," Desmond said, and his voice had that particular quality of someone who's been awake all night and is trying very hard to sound like they haven't been. "Dad, I just got the message. The hospital called last night, but the service here is terrible, and I didn't see it until this morning." The music got quieter. A door closing, maybe. Viveka's voice got sharper. I caught fragments now. Non-refundable. Policy. We already... "How are you?" Desmond asked, and I could hear him trying to mean it. "Alive," I said. That's good. That's really good, Dad. The message said stable condition, and I looked it up. That means you're..." "Desmond!" He stopped. I'd said his name the way I used to when he was 12 and had just gotten caught hiding a report card the way that made him understand I already knew whatever he was about to say, and we could skip directly to the part where he told me the truth. Silence. 5 seconds. 10. Viveka's voice again, a whispered hiss I couldn't quite parse. Dad? Here's the thing, Desmond said finally. The resort has a policy. We're already here and Viveka Lucy is with us and we already paid for the whole 2 weeks and the doctor said you're not in danger, right? I mean, stable means stable. And the thing is, the cancellation fee is basically the entire cost, so we'd be paying for it anyway, and Lucy, his daughter, my granddaughter, 16 years old, I'd met her twice. I didn't say anything. I can call every day. Desmond said, the words coming faster now. Morning and evening I'll call, and if anything changes I can get a flight. There are flights every day, and Viveka already checked, and... Desmond, I said again. He stopped. I said one word, go. The silence that followed lasted 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, I heard Desmond exhale a long, slow breath that carried more relief than a man should feel when his father tells him to abandon a hospital bedside. The relief was real. It was wrapped in the thinnest possible coating of guilt, but underneath that coating was pure, genuine relief. That exhale, that sigh of relief was real. Okay, Desmond said. Okay, Dad, thank you. Thank you for understanding. We'll call every day. Viveka sends her regards. You work too hard anyway, you should rest. He hung up before I could respond to that last part, which was perhaps the most effective thing he had ever done for me. I lay there looking at the ceiling. White acoustic tiles. The same pattern is repeating. I had one more call to make, and it mattered more than I understood at the time. I made 2 phone calls before 8:30 Tuesday morning, each under 4 minutes, and neither one required explanation. The first call went to Ross Stafford at 8 o'clock exactly. Ross had been my chief financial officer for 19 years. Which meant he'd been managing the money side of Harborline Marine Services since before we had enough money to justify the word chief in anyone's title. He was 65 years old, precise in the way that accountants and watchmakers are precise, and in 19 years he had never once needed me to explain a decision twice. He answered on the first ring. Ross, I said, suspend the monthly transfer to Desmond's account, effective this morning, indefinitely. Silence. 3 seconds. I heard him breathing on the other end of the line, heard the small sound of him setting down whatever he'd been holding, probably his coffee mug, the one his daughter had made him in a pottery class 15 years ago that said, World's Most Adequate Dad. The amount, Ross asked. $8,500. Done, he said. Anything else? Not today. He hung up. 3 minutes, 40 seconds. The transfer I'd been making to Desmond's personal account every month for the past 9 years, ever since Desmond had explained that his consulting work required certain lifestyle maintenance costs and the optics mattered in his industry, stopped. Just stopped. You need to understand something about the kind of man Ross Stafford is. He has been managing my money for 19 years and has never once needed me to explain a decision twice. When I told him to freeze Desmond's draw, he didn't ask why. He didn't ask if I was sure. He didn't suggest we discuss it when I was feeling better or when I'd had time to think it through. He asked for the amount to confirm he had the right account, and then he said done. That's the difference between people who do work and people who do theater. The second call went to a private nursing agency on Union Avenue at 8:15. I'd looked up the number on my phone while waiting for my breakfast tray eggs that tasted like the idea of eggs toast that had the structural integrity of cardboard coffee that was technically coffee in the same way that hospital gowns are technically clothing. A woman answered. Professional voice efficient. I need a private nurse, I said. Live-in care starting Wednesday if possible. Post-surgical recovery lung injury limited mobility. We have several qualified candidates, she said. I heard keys clicking. How long do you anticipate needing care? 2 weeks minimum, possibly longer. More clicking. I have someone available. Beverly Cooper, 61, 17 years experience in post-surgical and respiratory care. Excellent references. She's currently assigned to Massachusetts General, but her rotation ends Tuesday night. Beverly Cooper, the same nurse who'd told me about Desmond's after-dinner callback with the kind of honesty that comes from seeing too many families fail in hospital hallways. When can she start? I asked. Wednesday morning, 6 a.m. Send me the contract, I said. 4 minutes, 12 seconds. 2 calls, 8 minutes total. I'd cut off my son's monthly income and arranged for private care that would cost me more in 2 weeks than Desmond's draw had cost in 6 months. The math didn't make sense unless you understood that one of those expenses was an investment and the other one had been a subsidy for a grown man who'd spent 9 years confusing his father's hope with his father's obligation. I set the phone down on the bedside table next to the plastic water pitcher and the box of tissues and the small pile of get well cards from people at the shipyard who probably didn't know how to reach me any other way. The phone stayed silent. No calls from Ibiza, no messages. Just the number 94 glowing in my recent calls list, like a monument to effort I hadn't asked for and didn't want. The on-call nurse came in around 8:30 to check my IV, not Beverly, someone different. Nurse Maloney, according to her badge. Broad-shouldered gray hair pulled back in a bun tight enough to give me a headache just looking at it, the kind of efficient movement that comes from 20 years of hospital floors. She took one look at my expression and stopped. "You want to talk about whatever's on your face?" she asked. "Or you want me to pretend I don't see it?" I almost laughed. Almost. "My son is in Ibiza," I said. "The resort has a cancellation policy." She stopped, turned around slowly, looked at me with the specific expression of someone who's worked hospital floors long enough to hear everything and is still occasionally genuinely surprised by the particular ways human beings manage to disappoint each other. One syllable. That was all it took. "Damn," Nurse Maloney said. She turned back around, adjusted the IV drip, made a note on her tablet, checked my blood pressure with the automatic cuff that squeezed too tight and beeped too loud. She worked in silence for 2 minutes. Professional, thorough, completely unbothered by the fact that we'd just had an entire conversation in about 15 words. She was almost at the door when she paused, looked back. "For what it's worth," she said, "I've got 3 kids. 2 of them would have been on the next plane. One of them would have asked about the cancellation policy." She didn't say which one she talked to anymore. She didn't have to. The door closed. The room went quiet again, just the beep of the monitors, the hiss of the oxygen line I didn't need anymore, but they hadn't removed yet the distant sound of a television playing in someone else's room down the hall. I looked out the window at the gray Boston Bay stretching below the October water, flat and cold under morning clouds. Somewhere out there beyond the buildings and the harbor traffic and the morning fog, Pier 9 was still standing. The caution tape would still be up. The investigation would still be ongoing. The pipe I should have replaced 3 years ago would still be evidence of a decision I'd made because I wanted to believe my son understood something I didn't. But I wasn't thinking about the pier. I was thinking about a night 36 years ago when everything changed, and I was too young and too stupid to see it happening. I was thinking about a night 36 years ago when the wind howled like something alive and angry. Murray died on a Tuesday night during a storm at sea, and I have spent 36 years trying not to think about the sound the wind made through that small harbor kitchen where her 9-year-old son sat eating cereal at midnight because he couldn't sleep and didn't know what else to do. My sister, 31 years old, single mother, no husband, never had been one, never talked about who Noel's father was, and I'd learned early not to ask. No relatives except me, her older brother, 32 years old, and completely unprepared for what happened that Tuesday. Aneurysm. The doctor at Massachusetts General said it that way. Aneurysm, like the word itself, was supposed to explain anything. Sudden. Catastrophic. Nothing anyone could have done. She was on a commercial fishing vessel doing galley work 3 days out from Boston Harbor when it happened. They radioed for help, but she was gone before the Coast Guard helicopter even lifted off. They brought her body back on a Thursday. I brought Noel to my apartment that night because there was nowhere else for him to go. Small place, 1-bedroom kitchen, barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time. He sat in the corner on the floor with his back against the cabinet and ate cereal from the box. Dry, no milk, just handfuls of cereal, like it was the only thing in the world that still made sense. The storm kept going. Wind rattled the windows. Rain hit the glass in sheets. The whole building creaked. He looked up at me around midnight and asked 4 words. "Uncle Otis, what do I do now?" 9 years old. Red-rimmed eyes. His mother's dark hair sticking up in all directions. Wearing a sweatshirt 3 sizes too big that had been hers. I didn't have an answer. I was 32 years old, running a business that barely qualified as a business, living in an apartment that smelled like diesel and old coffee, and I didn't have a single answer that would make sense to a 9-year-old who just lost the only parent he'd ever had. But I said something anyway because the silence was worse than saying the wrong thing. "We stay," I told him. "That's what we do. We stay." He went back to eating cereal. I don't know if that was the right answer. I don't know if there was a right answer. But it was the answer I gave, and he stayed in that corner eating cereal until he fell asleep around 2 in the morning, and I carried him to my bed and slept on the couch, and in the morning we were still there. That was 36 years ago. The boy sitting in that kitchen eating cereal at midnight just walked through my hospital room door. I didn't hear him coming. The door just opened at 5:10 Tuesday evening, and there he was, Noel Barnes, 45 years old, still wearing his work coveralls from Harbor Line Marine Services, hair covered in the particular kind of coal dust that only comes from spending all day in the paint shop where the ventilation has never quite worked right. He looked like he'd come straight from the shipyard without stopping to change, without stopping to think about whether visiting hours had rules about showing up covered in work grime. He looked at me in the hospital bed, took in the casted knee, the IV line, the untouched dinner tray with its plastic dome covering something that was technically food, in the same way that hospital coffee is technically coffee. He pulled a chair from the corner without asking, dragged it across the linoleum with a sound that made the nurse down the hall probably wince, positioned it next to the bed and sat down, leaned forward, elbows on his knees, looked at me with eyes that were still his mother's eyes after 36 years. He said 4 words, "What do you need?" Not "Are you all right?" Not "I would have come sooner if I'd known." Not "I'm so sorry this happened." What do you need? 4 words. The same number of words he'd asked me 36 years ago in that kitchen during the storm, but reversed. He'd asked me what to do. Now he was asking me what I needed. And somehow, across 36 years and a lifetime of showing up at 5:30 every morning without being asked, those 4 words carried more weight than any eulogy I'd ever heard. I looked at him for a long moment, saw the coal dust in his hair, the grease under his fingernails, the way his coveralls had Harborline Marine Services stitched across the chest pocket in letters that were starting to fade because he'd been wearing the same uniform for 10 years and refused to requisition a new one until this one actually fell apart. "How did you find out?" I asked. His mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "Mrs. Pettigrew," he said, "lives on your street. She saw the ambulance Monday night, called the shipyard this morning asking if anyone knew whether you were all right. Said she tried your phone, but you weren't answering." Mrs. Pettigrew. 70-something widow who'd lived 3 houses down from me for 15 years and who I'd helped exactly twice, once when her car wouldn't start in January, once when her basement flooded during a spring storm. I'd given her my business card both times, told her to call if she needed anything. She'd kept the card. She'd called the shipyard, and Noel had come. I didn't know if I started then stopped, didn't know how to finish that sentence, didn't know if you'd hear about it, didn't know if you'd come. Both of those sounded wrong because the truth was simpler and harder. I hadn't called him because some part of me still wasn't sure I deserved for him to drop everything and show up covered in coal dust asking what I needed. "I know," Noel said like he could read the half-finished sentence and everything underneath it. "I'm here now." He leaned back in the chair, crossed his arms, looked at me the way he'd looked at me 10,000 times over 36 years, patient, steady, completely unbothered by the fact that I was a mess and he was here anyway. "What do you need?" I heard that stormy Tuesday night echoing back across 36 years. Heard the wind howling and the rain hitting the windows and a 9-year-old boy asking what to do now. Heard myself saying we stay. He'd stayed. For 36 years he'd stayed. And now he was asking me what I needed. And I finally had an answer that mattered. The answer I'd been looking for came down to one truth: I needed someone who understood without requiring explanation. Noel sat in that chair looking at me, and I saw the question form in his expression without him having to say the words. It was there in the slight shift of his eyes toward the empty chair on the other side of the bed, in the way he registered the single visitor, him, and did the math that any person would do when their uncle ends up in a hospital after a major accident. He didn't ask if Desmond had come. He didn't need to ask it out loud. "Desmond didn't need to come," I said. Noel nodded once. Just once. The nod contained complete understanding, complete acknowledgement of what that sentence actually meant and what it didn't mean, and absolutely zero judgment about any of it. He'd been doing that since he was 9 years old, absorbing information and filing it away in whatever part of his brain handled the permanent record of how things actually were versus how people pretended they were. That's Noel. He's never needed the full sentence. Most people require explanations. They need context and justification and the careful arrangement of facts in a particular order so they can arrive at the conclusion you're trying to lead them toward. Noel has never required any of that. You tell him half a thing and he's already 3 steps ahead, understanding the whole thing, and he's made his peace with it before you finish talking. Elena used to say her son absorbed information about people the way other children absorbed games, completely and permanently. She'd say it with this mix of pride and worry, like she knew it was a useful skill but wasn't entirely sure it was a comfortable way to move through the world. She was rarely wrong about anything, and she was least wrong about her own son. I remember one time when Noel was maybe 14, working his first summer at the shipyard doing paint shop cleanup. One of the older welders, guy named Frank, who'd been there since 1992, made some comment about how Noel was probably just killing time until he found real work, something with a college degree attached to it. Noel didn't argue, didn't defend himself, just kept cleaning paint rollers and organizing supplies, and 3 weeks later, when Frank's daughter was looking for summer work, Noel was the one who told her which positions were opening up and which foreman to talk to. Frank asked me later how Noel knew all that when the hiring schedule wasn't even posted yet. I told him Noel pays attention. You need to understand what it means when someone knows you well enough that they don't need you to finish your sentences. It means they've been watching. It means they've been listening to the things you say and the things you don't say, and they've assembled a complete picture of who you actually are, not who you're trying to be. It means you can't hide from them even when you want to. Noel had known for years, probably since he was 16 or 17, that something was wrong with how I'd structured things. He'd never said it out loud, never asked why Desmond got a title and a salary for showing up 3 days a week while Noel ran the entire operation for wages that barely reflected a quarter of what he actually did. Never mentioned that the office Desmond used had his name on the door, while Noel worked from a desk in the corner of the main floor that he shared with 2 shift supervisors. He just kept showing up at 5:30 every morning and doing the work that needed doing. And when people asked him questions about operations or contracts or scheduling, he answered them with the kind of authority that comes from actually knowing what you're talking about. I'd written my will 17 years ago, 2008. The year after Noel died, actually her death had reminded me that time doesn't wait for you to get your affairs in order, so I'd finally done the responsible thing and made it official. 17 years ago, I'd believed that keeping family peace and keeping family fairness were the same objective. I'd structured the will the way you're supposed to structure these things when you have a son, everything split, according to blood and law and the conventional wisdom about how inheritance works. Desmond got the business. Desmond got the house. Desmond got the liquid assets and the retirement accounts, and the 3 private piers in Boston Harbor that nobody in the family except Noel knew existed because nobody except Noel had ever bothered to learn what I actually owned. Noel got a thank you for his years of service and a one-time payment that wouldn't have covered 6 months of his actual value. I'd thought I was being fair because I was following the rules. But Noel had known for 17 years that he wasn't in that will the way he should have been, and he never asked about it. Not once. 17 years, not once. That's the difference between someone who carries a secret as a burden, something heavy, they're waiting to deploy at the right moment for maximum effect, and someone who carries it as a responsibility. Someone who knows the thing and holds the thing and never makes you feel the weight of them knowing it. Desmond had called 94 times in 2 days from Ibiza asking about contracts and liability and what this meant for the business. Noel had shown up covered in coal dust asking what I needed. I thought about that will. Thought about the considerable distance between what a man is handed and what a man earns. Thought about 17 years of watching someone show up and do the work while someone else showed up and collected the credit. Thought about how Noel would feel if she knew I'd spent 17 years getting this exactly backward. Wednesday, I said to Noel, I need you here Wednesday morning early before the day shift starts. He didn't ask why, he just nodded. 6 a.m., he said, I'll be here. And I knew he would be the same way. I knew the sun would come up and Boston Bay would still be gray, and the calls from Ibiza would keep piling up on a phone I had no intention of answering. Wednesday was coming, and I had already made calls that would reach Desmond's ears long before noon. Wednesday was coming, but Tuesday evening still had work to do. Noel went down to the hospital cafeteria and came back with food that did not have mushrooms in it, because he has known since he was 14 years old that I cannot stand mushrooms and has never once needed reminding. He set the tray down on the rolling table without ceremony. Hospital meatloaf that had the structural integrity of construction material mashed potatoes that were approximately the right color green beans that had been cooked until they surrendered all structural ambition. Standard institutional food that claimed no excellence and delivered exactly what it promised. No mushrooms. I looked at the plate, looked at Noel pulling the chair back to the corner where he'd found it preparing to leave without making a production of staying. Cafeteria wasn't much, he said, but it's edible. Thank you, I said. He nodded and headed for the door, stopped halfway, turned back. 6 a.m. Wednesday, he said. 6 a.m., I confirmed. He left. The door closed with the particular soft click that hospital doors make, designed not to wake patients, as if anyone in a hospital actually sleeps through the night with monitors beeping and vitals being checked every 4 hours. I sat looking at that dinner tray. No mushrooms. He'd remembered from when he was 14 years old, 31 years ago. 31 years of knowing this small detail about what I could and couldn't eat, and he'd never once needed to be reminded. I had to look out the window at Boston Bay where the evening light was fading into that particular purple that comes right before full dark. 68 years old, 2 sons, 36 years of making sure the wrong one never felt overlooked while the right one just went down to the cafeteria and found dinner without being asked and brought it back without mushrooms because he'd been paying attention since he was 14. And nobody had ever thought to notice that he was paying attention. How does a father spend 36 years getting something this fundamental exactly backward? I ate the meatloaf. It tasted like regret and institutional purchasing contracts, but I ate it anyway because Noel had brought it, and that meant something even if I'd spent 3 decades being too stupid to understand what it meant. The nurses changed shift at 7. Dr. Keaton came through at 8 to check my vitals and tell me the lung inflammation was responding to treatment. She left instructions about Wednesday's discharge procedures that I only half listened to because I was already thinking about what came after discharge, about sealed envelopes and phone calls and 17-year-old wills that needed correcting. The hospital went quiet around 9. Not silent hospitals are never silent, but quiet enough that you could hear individual sounds instead of the general chaos of a medical facility managing a few hundred lives simultaneously. Monitors beeping in other rooms, a television playing somewhere down the hall, the soft squeak of nurse shoes on linoleum, the elevator chime every few minutes. I waited until 10:30, made sure the hallway outside was empty. Then I reached for the bedside table and pulled out the notebook and pen that Nurse Maloney had left there Tuesday morning when I'd asked if she had paper I could use. 1 page, blue ink, left hand because my right wrist was in a cast, and writing with my left hand made each word take longer, made me think about whether each sentence actually needed to exist before I committed it to paper. I wrote a letter to Desmond. Not the legal documents, those would come from Clarence Webb's office, formal and precise and filed in triplicate. This was different. This was what I needed to say in my words, not a lawyer's words before the official paperwork arrived to make it permanent. I didn't write it to be cruel because cruelty is simple and I had no patience left for simple. I wrote what the 9 years of monthly transfers had actually been. Not support, not generosity in any meaningful sense of that word, not even love, though I'd told myself it was love for most of those 9 years. Guilt. How does a father spend 9 years writing checks and call it love when he knows it's something else entirely? When he knows he's paying his son to maintain the illusion that they have a relationship that means something beyond the monthly transfer notification? I wrote that I'd watched myself build a transactional relationship with my own son, one check at a time, that I'd convinced myself I was helping when what I was actually doing was avoiding the conversation about why Desmond kept needing help, avoiding the question of whether the help was helping, avoiding the fundamental truth that a grown man in his 40s asking his father for money every month is not asking for money. He's asking for something else entirely, and giving him money is the easiest way to avoid figuring out what that something else actually is. Not love, guilt. I wrote that I was sorry for the guilt, sorry that I'd let it masquerade as something better for so long, but I wasn't sorry for stopping it. Some things you apologize for, some things you just stop doing and live with the fact that you should have stopped them sooner. I wrote that the transfers were suspended indefinitely and that he should consider what kind of man he wanted to be when there wasn't a monthly check telling him he didn't have to figure it out yet. 1 page. Each sentence cost me something real. Each word written with my left hand in blue ink that looked shakier than I wanted it to look, but was honest in a way that typed words wouldn't have been. I signed it, folded it, slid it into an envelope that Nurse Maloney had found for me when I'd asked, sealed it, wrote Desmond's suburban address on the front in that same shaky left-handed script. I placed the envelope on the bedside tray next to the empty dinner plate that had contained meatloaf without mushrooms. On Friday morning, Clarence Webb would courier this letter to Desmond's address, timed to arrive before the legal documents, but after the suspended transfer would have failed to appear in Desmond's account. Before that happened, there was still a great deal to do. Wednesday morning, Beverly Cooper would arrive for her first day, and she would accomplish more in 45 minutes than my son had managed in 9 years. Thursday morning brought a shift in the air. Beverly Cooper arrived early to finalize the discharge, and within 40 minutes, she had accomplished more on my behalf than my son had managed in 9 years. She came through the door carrying a canvas bag that looked like it had been with her through a few hundred patient assignments, set it down on the chair by the window, and shook my good hand with the kind of firm grip that says she's worked difficult situations without wasted motion and doesn't plan to start wasting motion now. "Mr. Barnes," she said, "I'm Beverly Cooper. We met Monday when they brought you in." "I remember," I said. She pulled my chart from the holder at the foot of the bed, scanned it with the practiced speed of someone who's read 10,000 medical charts and knows exactly which details matter and which ones are just documentation theater. "Did you sleep?" she asked. "Some." "Did you eat?" "Enough." She made a sound that suggested she had opinions about both answers, but had decided to address them through action rather than argument. Smart woman. What happened in the next 45 minutes was a masterclass in the difference between someone who does work and someone who manages the appearance of work. Beverly reviewed my medication schedule and restructured it so that the pain management didn't conflict with the anti-inflammatory that had been making me nauseous every morning. She briefed the 2 on-call nurses on things they'd missed, small things. The kind of details that don't kill you immediately, but add up over time into complications that extend hospital stays and create problems that didn't need to exist. She asked why the ventilator compression assist was set to a pressure that seemed high for my injury profile. The nurse said that's what it had been set to. Beverly asked when. The nurse didn't know. Beverly checked the equipment log herself, found it had been set wrong 6 weeks ago during a system update, and had the facilities department fix it before noon. 6 weeks. The hospital staff had been running every respiratory patient on that floor through a ventilator system that was calibrated wrong, and nobody had caught it until a private nurse showed up and spent 45 minutes actually reading the equipment settings instead of assuming someone else had already checked them. I watched her work. 61 years old, gray hair pulled back in a bun that probably hadn't changed style in 20 years, moving through that hospital room like someone who'd been working difficult situations for so long that competence wasn't something she thought about anymore. It was just how she moved through the world. 45 minutes. I thought about 9 years, about $8,500 a month, $76,500 a year, $687,000 total, give or take depending on which year you started counting and whether you included the occasional extra transfers when Desmond's consulting business hit what he called temporary cash flow challenges. $687,000. Beverly Cooper fixed more in 45 minutes than Desmond had accomplished in 9 years of monthly deposits. She finished reviewing the chart, made notes on her tablet, then looked at me with those sharp eyes that had seen me at my worst Monday night and weren't particularly impressed by hospital gowns or fractured patellas or men who thought they were tougher than pneumonia. "Discharge is tomorrow if your vitals hold," she said. "I'll be at your house Friday morning to set up the home care routine. You'll do what I tell you to do when I tell you to do it, or you'll end up back here in 2 weeks with complications that we both know are avoidable." "Yes, ma'am," I said. She almost smiled, almost. "Good," she said. "I'll be back this afternoon to check the new ventilator settings." She left at 10 o'clock exactly. 45 minutes. I sat there thinking about the particular mathematics of value and time and the distance between what people cost and what they're actually worth. Noel arrived at 11 with coffee. Not hospital coffee. Real coffee from the cafe on Atlantic Avenue that I'd been going to since 2003, back when it was just a counter and 3 tables and a guy named Marcus who roasted beans in a converted garage. Dark roast, no sugar, splash of cream. Noel handed it across without asking, without needing to confirm, because he'd known since he was 14 years old how I took my coffee. 14 years old, riding shotgun in my truck on Saturday mornings while I ran the company books before the work week started, stopping at that cafe on Atlantic Avenue because it was on the way, and because Marcus made coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of like the idea of coffee. 31 years ago, Noel remembered. "Atlantic Avenue," he said, "same as always." I took the cup. The lid was on tight. He'd checked it the way he always checked it, because one time in 2005, a loose lid had spilled coffee all over my truck's front seat, and he'd felt bad about it for 3 months, even though it wasn't his fault, and I'd told him it didn't matter. 20 years ago, still checking the lid. "Thank you," I said. Noel pulled the chair over, sat down. We didn't talk much. Didn't need to. He'd brought coffee that I liked from the place I'd been going to for 22 years, prepared the way I'd been drinking it for longer than that. That said more than most conversations managed to say in an hour. Beverly came back at 2 to check the ventilator settings, confirmed they were correct now, made more notes, left. We sat there, 2 people in a hospital room, being honest about where we were standing, no performance attached to it. I have sat in enough boardrooms and difficult conversations to know that doesn't always happen. That when it does happen, you should probably notice it and maybe even be grateful for it. I did not linger on the comparison between Noel's coffee and Desmond's 94 missed calls, because the comparison had edges, and I was trying to be fair. But the comparison was already made, and by Wednesday afternoon it would reach Desmond's ears in Ibiza, whether I wanted it to or not. It reached Desmond's ears faster than I expected, but then incompetence has always moved at surprising speed. While I was looking at the tablet on my bedside table, an automated alert popped up from our corporate bank account. Ross Stafford had already frozen the main monthly transfer as ordered, but his team had just flagged 3 separate high-end transaction attempts from a rooftop lounge and a luxury spa in Ibiza. Desmond was trying to use the company emergency credit card to cover his vacation bills, completely unaware that his primary access had already been cut off. 3 times. Restaurant, spa, bar, 2 hours. It took him exactly 2 hours after my call to realize his financial safety net was starting to tear. I sat with that information for 90 minutes. Didn't need to process it, the processing was already done. Just needed to let it settle into the permanent record of decisions that couldn't be unmade even if I wanted to unmake them. At 2 o'clock, I called Clarence Webb. Clarence had been managing my estate for 22 years at $400 an hour. And the reason I kept paying him $400 an hour was because he had exactly zero opinions about anything that wasn't directly related to legal strategy. He didn't ask why I wanted things done a particular way. He asked what I wanted done, confirmed I understood the implications, and then did it with the kind of precision that comes from 3 decades of making sure rich people's intentions survive their deaths intact. He answered on the second ring. "Clarence," I said, "the will, 17 years old, it needs to be amended." Silence. 3 seconds. Not the silence of surprise. Clarence didn't do surprise. The silence of someone pulling up files in his head and reviewing relevant details before responding. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes. Wholesale changes or targeted amendments?" "Wholesale." Another pause. I heard keys clicking. He was already opening files, already starting the process, already doing what I paid him to do, which was translate my decisions into language that would survive legal scrutiny. "Tomorrow work?" he asked. "Yes." "Morning or afternoon?" "Morning, early." 9 a.m. My office, Peabody Place. I'll have everything prepared for review and signature. Questions? "No." "Good," he said. "See you tomorrow." He hung up. $400 an hour buys you a lot of things, but mostly it buys you someone who doesn't waste your time explaining things you already understand or asking questions designed to make them feel better about doing what you've asked them to do. I set the phone down. Thursday morning, 9 a.m. Peabody Place. The 17-year-old Will that gave everything to Desmond and almost nothing to Noel would cease to exist when I walked out of that building. I have sat in enough negotiations to know when a deal is closed, and when the other party just doesn't know it yet. I know what it looks like when the leverage shifts so completely that the outcome becomes inevitable even though the paperwork hasn't caught up to reality. This was that. Desmond was in Ibiza trying his frozen card at rooftop bars while I was in a hospital room in Boston scheduling an appointment that would restructure his entire future. He didn't know it yet. Wouldn't know it until Friday when the letter arrived and the legal documents followed a week later, formal and irreversible, and carrying the weight of decisions that had been 17 years in the making. But the deal was already closed. The rest was just paperwork. Beverly came back at 3 to check my vitals. Blood pressure stable. Oxygen levels good. Lung inflammation responding to treatment. She made notes on her tablet with the efficient precision of someone who'd been documenting patient progress for so long that she could probably write accurate medical assessments in her sleep. "Discharge tomorrow," she said. "Morning if tonight goes well. I'll be at your house Friday to set up the home care routine." "Friday," I repeated. She caught something in my tone. Looked at me with those sharp eyes that missed very little. "You've got somewhere to be Thursday," she said, not a question. "Attorney's office, 9 a.m. She nodded once. "I'll make sure the discharge paperwork is ready early. You'll need to take it easy, the knee is still healing and your lungs aren't going to appreciate rushing around." "I'll take it easy," I said. She made a sound that suggested she had opinions about how likely that was, but she'd already decided to address it through monitoring rather than argument. Smart woman. She left at 3:30. The room went quiet again, just the monitors beeping their steady rhythm and the distant sound of the hospital moving through its afternoon routines. I looked at the phone. 98 missed calls now. Desmond had added 4 more since Ross's report about the declined card attempts. Still hadn't answered a single one. Thursday morning. Peabody Place. Clarence Webb's office with the smell of old paper and serious money and the particular gravity of decisions that are going to outlast everyone in the room. The 17-year-old Will would cease to exist when I left that building. Before that appointment, there would be one more phone call, and this one I would answer. The phone call came exactly when I expected it, which was somehow more satisfying than if it had been a surprise. The phone vibrated at 3:45 Wednesday afternoon, and I knew before I looked at the screen that Desmond had discovered what I had done Tuesday morning. I picked it up, answered. "Dad." His voice was completely out of control, the careful composure he usually maintained shredded into something raw and panicked. "Dad, the card, I tried to make a reservation at this restaurant and the card was declined. I thought maybe it was a fraud alert or the bank made a mistake, so I tried it 2 more times and—" "I know," I said. Silence, 2 seconds, 3. "You know?" Desmond repeated, and I could hear him trying to process that, trying to find the angle that made sense. "You know it's not working. Did you call the bank? Because I suspended it," I said. Tuesday morning, indefinitely. The silence that followed had a different quality, heavier. The kind of silence that comes when someone realizes the ground they've been standing on wasn't actually ground. Then Viveka's voice cut in sharp and bright, and I realized Desmond had put me on speakerphone. "Otis," she said, and her voice had that practiced warmth that reminded me of customer service representatives trying to de-escalate situations they'd been trained to handle. "Otis, we're just concerned about your health. We heard about the accident and we've been so worried and we want to make sure you have everything you need. We tried calling, but I know what that warmth is covering, I said quietly. I have known for 9 years. That stopped her. I heard Desmond's breathing on the other end of the line, heard what sounded like wind or ocean in the background, heard the particular quality of expensive resort ambient noise that costs $200 a night to experience. We'll talk when you're home, I said, face to face, not before. I hung up before either of them could respond, and the silence that followed was the cleanest sound I had heard in 9 years. I set the phone down, looked at it sitting there on the bedside table screen, dark no longer vibrating with the weight of 98 missed calls and 14 voicemails I had no intention of listening to. Clean. I thought about the will, the 17-year-old will that I'd written in 2008, the year after my wife passed away. She'd been sick for 8 months, cancer that moved faster than the treatments could keep up with, and toward the end she'd talked a lot about legacy and family and what it meant to pass something down through bloodlines. She'd believed deeply in tradition, in the idea that a father's work should go to his son, that blood mattered more than merit, that family meant something specific and structured and unchangeable. She'd said it with the particular conviction of someone who'd grown up with very little and had strong opinions about how people with something to pass down should handle that responsibility. I'd written the will the way she would have wanted it. Everything to Desmond. The business, the house, the liquid assets, the 3 private piers that nobody in the family except Noel knew existed. A token payment to Noel enough to be respectable, not enough to matter. I'd told myself I was honoring her memory, respecting her beliefs, keeping faith with the woman I'd loved for 34 years, and who'd asked me to do this one thing the way she thought it should be done. 17 years. I'd told myself that story for 17 years. Sitting in that hospital bed. Phone dark beside me. Thursday's appointment with Clarence Webb already scheduled. I finally admitted what I'd actually been doing. I hadn't been honoring her memory. I'd been using her convictions as an excuse to avoid making a hard decision myself. How long does a man get to hide behind the preferences of someone who cannot speak anymore? How long does he get to say, this is what she would have wanted, when what he really means is, this is the easiest thing for me to do? Because the dead cannot be overruled, cannot object, cannot look at you with disappointment when you choose the path that requires the least courage. She'd believed in bloodline inheritance. I'd believed in not having to choose between my son and my nephew in a way that would make one of them angry and the other one grateful. I'd believed in avoiding conflict. I'd believed in keeping peace even when the peace was built on foundations that were slowly rotting. So I'd written the will she would have wanted, and I'd called it respect, and I'd lived with that story for 17 years. But it wasn't respect. It was convenience disguised as loyalty. The dead make excellent excuses because they never get a chance to clarify their positions, or change their minds, or look at new evidence and admit they might have been wrong. You can build entire fortresses of avoidance on top of what the deceased believed, and nobody can argue with you because the only person who could dispute your interpretation isn't here to do it. I'd built 17 years on top of my wife's convictions about bloodline and tradition. And tomorrow morning, at 9 a.m. in Clarence Webb's office on Peabody Place, I was going to dismantle the whole structure and build something new in its place. Something that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with who showed up at 5:30 every morning for 23 years without needing to be asked. I thought about Mireille, my sister, the woman who'd raised Noel for 9 years before an aneurysm took her during a storm at sea. She'd been dead for 36 years, but I could still hear her voice sometimes, still remember the particular way she'd look at problems and cut through to what actually mattered. What would Mireille say about all of this, the will, the confrontation, the choice to give everything to Noel instead of following bloodline tradition? I knew the answer. She would cry first, overwhelmed the way she cried at beauty and injustice both. Her eyes would get wet and she'd try to hide it and fail completely. And then she would say it was about damn time. Wednesday evening I would tell Noel about the Thursday appointment with Clarence Webb. I told Noel about the appointment with Clarence Webb the next morning, because there are some conversations a man does not postpone once he understands they are 17 years overdue. He was still in the room. 7:15 Wednesday evening. Dinner trays cleared, shift change done. The hospital settled into its nighttime rhythm. Noel sat in the chair by the window, laptop open, working through what looked like a supply order for the shipyard paint shop. He did that, brought work to places other people wouldn't manage entire operations, from hospital chairs and truck cabs. I have an appointment tomorrow, I said. Clarence Webb, 9 a.m. Peabody Place. He looked up, waited. The will is 17 years old, I said. Something shifted in his eyes. Recognition. Understanding that we'd arrived at a conversation that had been waiting for both of us for a very long time. I wrote it when I believed keeping the family together and keeping things fair were the same goal, I said. I've realized they're not. Noel closed the laptop, set it aside, gave me his full attention the way he'd been giving me his full attention since he was 9 years old, asking what to do now. What is fair is not always what keeps peace, I said, and I am done choosing peace over justice. The words sounded bigger out loud than they'd sounded in my head, more formal, but they were true, so I let them stand. Tomorrow I'm changing it, I said. All of it, the business, the house, the private peers, everything. How does a man explain that he spent 17 years writing a will that denied the person who earned everything while giving it all to the person who earned nothing? How does he say, I was wrong for 17 years and I'm fixing it now? Even though now doesn't give you back the 17 years you spent knowing you weren't in it. You don't explain it, you just say it. I should have done this a long time ago, I said. Noel looked out the window. Boston Bay was darkening into night, the water turning from gray to black, a few boat lights moving across the harbor like slow stars. He sat with that view for a long moment, and I let him sit with it because some information requires time to process, even when you already knew it was coming. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. You don't owe me anything, he said. What you did after Mom died was enough, more than enough. You didn't have to take in a 9-year-old kid who wasn't yours. You didn't have to raise him or give him a job or teach him the business or... Let me finish what I started, I said. He stopped, looked at me. 36 years ago, I told you we stay. That's what we do. We stay. I meant it then. I mean it now. Let me finish what I started. The silence that followed was the longest we'd had all week. Maybe the longest we'd had in years. It had weight, the kind that comes when two people are being completely honest about something that matters, and neither one knows quite what to say next. Noel looked out the window again. I watched him process it, the slight movement of his jaw, the way his hands rested on his knees. The particular stillness that meant he was thinking hard about something he wasn't sure how to put into words. One nod. 36 years of earned loyalty acknowledged in a single movement of the head. That's what he gave me. One nod. Simple. Final. Accepting what I'd said without making a performance out of gratitude or trying to argue me out of it, or asking what this meant for Desmond or any of the 1,000 questions a different person might have asked. Just one nod. Okay, he said. Okay, I repeated. He picked up his laptop, opened it, went back to the supply order like we'd just discussed the weather instead of restructuring the next 30 years of both our lives. That was Noel. You tell him something big, he processes it, he accepts it, he goes back to work. No drama, no performance, just acknowledgement and forward motion. I watched him work for a few minutes. Watched him do what he'd been doing for 23 years, managing the 1,000 small details that kept a business running while other people took credit for the big picture. That nod was going to cost him something too, in the best possible way. It was going to cost him the anonymity he'd been operating in for 2 decades. The safety of working without a title that matched his actual authority. The comfortable distance between responsibility and recognition. By Friday morning, everything would be different. The business would be his, the private peers would be his, the house on the harbor would be his, the weight of a $40 million maritime empire would be his to carry, his to build, his to pass down when his own time came. But I did not tell him that yet. Did not tell him about the 17 pages Clarence was preparing, or the specific language about succession and ownership, and the careful legal architecture that would transfer everything I'd built from my name to his. Thursday was coming, 8:30 a.m. Peabody Place. Clarence Webb's office with the smell of old paper and serious money, and the particular gravity of decisions that were going to outlast everyone in the room. 2 hours and 17 pages that would rewrite 36 years. Noel closed his laptop at 8:30. Said he'd be back Friday morning to help with discharge. I told him Friday morning was fine. He left. The room went quiet. I lay there looking at the ceiling, thinking about tomorrow, thinking about the will that would cease to exist when I walked out of that building, thinking about the new will that would replace it. Thinking about one nod and what it meant and what it was going to cost both of us in the best possible way. Thursday arrived exactly when it was supposed to, which meant I'd been ready for it since before dawn. I had been awake since before 5 Thursday morning, watching my phone accumulate missed calls in the darkness, and I had answered exactly none of them because I was not ready yet. 94 calls. The number glowed on my phone screen in the pre-dawn dark like an accusation I had no intention of responding to. Same number that had been there Wednesday morning. Same caller. Different desperation. Desmond had tried 16 more times overnight, each attempt registering in my phone's call log like a petition I'd already denied, but he kept filing anyway. I lay in that hospital bed watching Boston Bay lighten from black to gray through the window. My lungs still struggling with each breath, the way they'd been struggling since Monday's explosion. And I thought about discipline. You need to understand something about the way I have run my business for 31 years. I do not waste words, and I do not speak until I am ready. I have fired 17 people in those 31 years, 17 people who needed to be let go for reasons ranging from incompetence to theft to simply being fundamentally wrong for the work we did. Each one of those 17 people received exactly the sentence they needed to hear. Not one syllable beyond it. Not one word of cushion or comfort or explanation beyond what was necessary to make the separation clean and final. This isn't working. Today is your last day. Human resources will handle the details. That was it. That was all it ever needed to be. Some of them argued, some of them cried, some of them threatened lawyers or tried to negotiate or asked for second chances they hadn't earned and wouldn't use well even if I gave them. I said the same thing to all of them. The decision is final. And it was. Because I did not speak until I was ready, and once I spoke, the speaking was done. Desmond had 94 calls worth of words he wanted to say to me. 94 attempts to argue or negotiate or explain or whatever he thought he needed to do to make me reverse what I'd done Tuesday morning. But I was not ready to hear them yet. Friday was coming. Friday the letter would arrive. Friday the legal documents would follow. Friday I would answer the phone and have exactly one conversation that would last exactly as long as it needed to last and not 1 second longer. I was keeping every word I had for Friday. The rest was just silence. Beverly came in at 6 to check my vitals one last time before discharge. Blood pressure stable, oxygen levels good, lung function improving but still compromised. She made notes on her tablet with the efficient precision of someone who'd documented 1,000 patient progressions and knew exactly which numbers mattered. "You're cleared for discharge," she said. "Don't do anything stupid between now and when I see you tomorrow." "Yes, ma'am," I said. She almost smiled. Almost. 7 a.m. exactly, Noel arrived. I heard him before I saw him. The particular sound of work boots on hospital linoleum, the pace neither hurried nor slow, just purposeful. He came through the door wearing his work coat keys already in his hand, punctual the way he'd been punctual for 36 years. 36 years of showing up when he said he would, where he said he would, ready to do whatever needed doing. "Morning," he said. "Morning," I said. Beverly handed him the discharge paperwork. 2 pages of instructions about medication schedules, wound care, physical therapy, appointments, restrictions on activity level, warning signs that would require immediate medical attention. She read them aloud. Noel listened without writing a single word down, without asking her to repeat anything, without pulling out his phone to make notes or take pictures of the instruction sheet. He just listened, memorized everything, the way he'd been memorizing every detail about me since he was 9 years old, sitting in a kitchen at midnight, eating cereal and asking what to do now. "Pain medication every 6 hours, Beverly said. "No stairs for 2 weeks. Physical therapy starts Monday. Any fever over 100 degrees, you call me immediately." Noel nodded once. She looked at him the way sharp people look at other sharp people when they recognize competence. "You'll actually follow these instructions," she said, not a question. "Yes, ma'am," Noel said. She handed him the paperwork. He signed the discharge forms in 3 places, dated them, handed them back. The whole transaction took 90 seconds. Then he helped me into my jacket. The same jacket I'd been wearing Monday when the pipe exploded. Now cleaned and folded by someone on the hospital staff who'd thought to do that without being asked. Noel held it, while I worked my left arm into the sleeve, then helped navigate the right arm past the cast on my wrist. Didn't make a production of it, didn't hover, just helped the way someone helps a person they've been taking care of for their entire life. Because in every important sense, in every way that actually counted, he had been. I'd raised him from 9 years old to 45. But somewhere in those 36 years, the relationship had shifted. Somewhere between teaching him how to read a contract and watching him run an entire maritime operation without needing my approval, he'd become the one doing the taking care of. And I'd let him. Because he was better at it than I was. Because he paid attention to details I missed. Because he remembered things I forgot. Because when I ended up in a hospital bed with a fractured knee and damaged lungs, he was the one who showed up at 7 a.m. exactly with his keys in his hand, ready to drive me to the most important appointment of my life. We walked to the elevator, slow because my knee didn't appreciate speed yet. Noel matched my pace without comment, positioned himself on my right side where the cast made balance harder, ready to catch me if I stumbled but not touching me unless I needed it. The elevator doors opened. We stepped inside 2 people who understood each other without requiring explanations, heading toward an office on Peabody Place where everything was about to change. No words between us. We had never needed them. Noel drove us through the harbor where I built everything from nothing, and the nothing was still there, but everything had been replaced by something I did not recognize. His truck smelled like diesel and old coffee and 36 years of morning drives to work sites that required his attention. The engine made a sound that suggested it had been making that sound since 2010 and would keep making it until something fundamental gave out. Noel drove the way he did everything steadily economically, eyes forward, no wasted motion. We took the harbor route, past the docks where I'd built the first dry dock in 1995, past the welding shop that used to be a seafood processing plant until the owner died, and I bought the building for $40,000 and converted it into something useful. Past the place where my first workshop stood. 31 years ago, that workshop was a dilapidated tin shack with a corrugated roof that leaked when it rained and walls thin enough that you could hear the harbor wind through them even when the windows were closed. $11,000 I didn't have borrowed from a bank that gave me a loan because the loan officer's brother worked on fishing boats and knew my reputation. That shack was where it all began. It was gone now, completely demolished. In its place stood a gleaming apartment complex with a sign out front that read Harbor View Residences in letters designed to look modern and expensive. The building was 6 stories of glass and steel and the particular kind of architectural optimism that comes from developers who believe waterfront property will always appreciate faster than inflation. I looked out the truck window at that sign, looked at the building where my workshop used to be, said nothing. 31 years from that leaking shack to an $18 million maritime empire. And now the shack didn't even exist except in my memory and whatever municipal records the city kept about demolished buildings and construction permits. Noel drove past without comment. He knew what used to be there. Probably remembered it better than I did. He'd spent his first summer working in that shop when he was 14, learning how to clean paint rollers and organize supplies and show up on time. We drove through Midtown, past the corporate office where Harborline Marine Services had grown from a one-man operation into something that required actual management infrastructure, past the bank where Ross Stafford had been managing my accounts for 19 years, past the cafe on Atlantic Avenue where Noel still bought my coffee the way I'd been drinking it since 2003, into downtown where the buildings got taller and the rent got higher and the people walking the sidewalks carried briefcases instead of toolboxes, where Clarence Webb had been keeping my legal affairs in order for 22 years. Before I walk through Clarence Webb's door and change 36 years of decisions if you're still with me, comment. A, if you think what I'm about to do is justified, or B, if you think I'm making a mistake. Add one short reason why. Quick note: what follows includes some recreated details for narrative impact. The lesson is what matters. Peabody Place, Old Money Street, the kind of address where the architecture itself commands respect. The air inside the building was thick with the scent of polished oak and decades of ironclad confidentiality. It was a place where multi-million-dollar transitions happened without a single voice being raised, and where a family's destiny could be rewritten over a single cup of black coffee. Noel pulled into the parking structure at 8:15. We took the elevator to the 3rd floor, walked down a hallway with carpet thick enough to muffle footsteps and lighting designed to make everyone look 10 years older and 20% more serious. Clarence Webb met us at his office door personally. 70 years old. Gray suit pressed with the kind of precision that suggested he either had a tailor on retainer or held his dry cleaner to standards most people reserved for surgeons. His expression carried the particular quality of a man who had spent 4 decades knowing exactly what people were worth and exactly what they had done to deserve it. "Mr. Barnes," he said, shaking my good hand. "Noel." "Clarence," I said. He opened the door, led us into an office that smelled like old paper and serious money and the particular gravity of decisions that were going to outlast everyone in the room. The conference table was mahogany. Real mahogany, not veneer. The kind of table that had probably witnessed 1,000 estate planning sessions and knew how to keep its opinions to itself. The 17-year-old will was already laid out flat on that table when we walked in, waiting like judgment. I looked at it, looked at the pages I'd signed in 2008, when I believed keeping my deceased wife's wishes and doing the right thing were the same objective. Looked at the careful legal language that gave everything to Desmond and almost nothing to Noel and called it family tradition. "You reviewed the notes?" I asked Clarence. "Thoroughly," he said. "Questions?" "None." "I'm certain," I said. "Then we begin," Clarence said. He pulled a chair for me. Noel took the seat beside mine. Clarence sat across from us with a folder that I knew contained the new will's 17 pages that would replace 17 years of getting it wrong. "I have sat in enough negotiations to know when the most important deal of your life is about to close. Know what it feels like when the leverage shifts and the outcome becomes inevitable, and all that's left is the paperwork that makes it permanent." This was that. The 17-year-old will spread flat on that conference table would cease to exist in 2 hours. 2 hours of reading and signing and witnessing and notarizing. 17 pages of careful legal architecture that would transfer a $40 million maritime empire from the wrong hands to the right ones. 2 hours, 17 pages, blue ink, and 36 years of a man's life finally finding the right hand to hold it. But there was something Clarence needed to tell me first, something I had set in motion 8 months before I ever ended up in that hospital bed. We were 40 minutes into the rewrite when Clarence looked at me over his reading glasses and said something that reframed every decision I had made since Monday. "For the record, Otis," he said, setting down his pen with the particular precision of a man who'd spent 4 decades making sure every detail mattered. "You contacted me 8 months ago, February, asked about will replacement process and legal requirements." I nodded. "That's correct." Noel looked at me, didn't say anything, just looked. "So the accident wasn't the catalyst," Clarence said. "Not a question, a statement for the record." "The accident was the timing," I said. "The decision was made in February." Clarence made a note on his legal pad. Continued reading through the new provisions like we'd just confirmed the weather instead of revealing that I'd been planning this for 8 months before a pipeline explosion put me in a hospital bed. 8 months, not a reaction, a plan. February 2025, cold month. I'd been sitting in my office at the shipyard going through the annual financial reports that Ross Stafford prepared every January, looking at the numbers, looking at the transfers to Desmond's account, $8,500 a month for 8 years, at that point nearly $800,000 total. Looking at Noel's salary fare for what the paperwork said he did criminal for what he actually did. I'd called Clarence that afternoon, asked him about the legal process for replacing a will, how long it took, what it required, whether there were ways to structure it so that the replacement would be ironclad against challenges. He'd told me, I'd listened, I'd thanked him and told him I'd be in touch when I was ready. Then I'd waited, watched. Gave Desmond 8 more months to prove me wrong about him. 8 more months of $8,500 deposits. 8 more months of Noel showing up at 5:30 every morning while Desmond showed up 3 days a week when it was convenient. 8 months. The pipeline explosion didn't make me decide to change the will. It gave me permission to stop waiting, and Desmond chose the exact moment himself when he called Tuesday morning from Ibiza with dance music blasting in the background and Viveka whispering about cancellation policies and told me the resort had rules about refunds. Clarence kept reading, page after page of careful legal language that Ross had helped me structure back in March after I'd told him I was considering major estate changes and needed his input on the financial architecture. Ross had asked exactly one question: "Are you certain?" I'd said yes. He'd built the financial framework. Clarence had built the legal framework. And I'd waited for the moment that would make it impossible for anyone to argue I was acting impulsively or under duress or influenced by temporary anger. A pipeline explosion that nearly killed me seemed like sufficient justification. But the truth was simpler and colder. I'd known for 8 months what needed to be done. I'd just been waiting for Desmond to confirm one more time that I was right about him. He'd confirmed it at 6:30 Tuesday morning. 2 hours total, 17 pages, blue ink on white paper that would outlast everyone in this room. Clarence read each provision aloud, made sure I understood, made sure Noel understood, even though Noel didn't know yet that his name was appearing on these pages in places that would change his entire life. Harborline Marine Services, Clarence read. 70% controlling interest plus operating rights to all 3 private Boston Harbor piers transferred to Noel Barnes effective upon grantor's death or voluntary transfer during grantor's lifetime. Noel's expression didn't change, but I saw something shift behind his eyes. Recognition maybe, understanding that we weren't just updating paperwork. Remaining 30% of company assets, Clarence continued, directed to Poor Fishermen's Relief Fund established Boston Harbor 1982 in memory of Noel Barnes. The fund where Noel had volunteered before she died, where she'd brought 9-year-old Noel on Saturday afternoons and let him sit in the corner reading while she helped struggling families fill out assistance applications and navigate bureaucracies that seemed designed to make help as difficult as possible to access. 30% of a maritime empire to honor the sister who'd raised a son who turned into exactly the kind of man who deserved 70% of that same empire. 70% to the person who earned everything. 30% to honor the sister who raised him right. The mathematics of justice measured and proportional and final. Desmond Barnes, Clarence read, and his voice had the particular neutral quality of a man reading something he had opinions about but had been paid $400 an hour not to share them. Suburban residence current assessed value $350,000. I looked at Noel. Fair return for a son who did just enough to almost qualify as one. Noel didn't respond. Just sat there processing 17 pages of decisions that rewrote 36 years. Clarence finished reading, turned to the signature pages. 3 copies, one for his files, one for my records, one for the courier service that would deliver notification to all interested parties. I signed each page where Clarence indicated. Blue ink, left hand because my right was still in a cast. Each signature shakier than I wanted it to be, but legal nonetheless. Clarence witnessed, his paralegal witnessed. Notary seal applied to each copy with the particular precision of people who understood that sloppy paperwork could cost clients millions in probate court. 10:30 Thursday morning, 2 hours, 17 pages, done. Clarence sealed the envelope himself. Blue wax stamp from his desk, old-fashioned but effective. Marked it for courier service Friday morning to Desmond's suburban address. Copy of the new 17-page will. Copy of the letter I had written left-handed Tuesday night in a hospital bed while I waited for Wednesday to arrive. Everything Desmond needed to understand that 9 years of $8,500 a month had purchased exactly nothing except a $350,000 house, and the knowledge that his father had been keeping score the entire time. Clarence handed me my copy of the new will, shook my hand, told me the courier would confirm delivery Friday afternoon. We left his office at 10:45. Walked back to the elevator, rode down to the parking structure, got in Noel's truck. And now I had to tell him what we had just done in that office. Noel pulled back into the hospital parking lot at 11 and cut the engine, and in that quiet truck I made myself say out loud what I had just given him. The engine ticked as it cooled. Through the windshield I could see the 4th floor of Massachusetts General Hospital, where I'd spent the last 3 days watching 94 missed calls accumulate and planning what would happen in Clarence Webb's office. I looked at Noel's profile. Mireille's jawline, Mireille's stillness, 36 years of her visible in the shape of his face, and the particular way he sat with difficult information, completely motionless, processing everything internally before deciding what needed to be said out loud. What we did in Clarence's office, I started. Otis, he said. I cut him off. You're getting the company, the peers, all of it. Silence. The longest silence of the week. Not uncomfortable, not shocked. Just Noel sitting with the weight of what I had just handed him, the way he'd been sitting with weight since he was 9 years old, asking what to do now, and I'd told him we stay. I watched him process it, watched the small movements that most people wouldn't notice, the slight shift of his shoulders, the way his hands settled differently on his knees, the particular quality of stillness that meant he was thinking hard about something he needed to understand completely before responding. He didn't flinch. Didn't manufacture surprise or gratitude or any of the performances people usually put on when someone tells them they're inheriting $40 million. Just sat there being exactly who he'd always been, someone who absorbed information completely and permanently before deciding what it meant. 45 seconds, I counted them. 45 seconds of silence that would have felt crushing with anyone else, but with Noel just felt like waiting for the right words to arrive. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. It's too much, he said. It's exactly enough, I said. And don't argue with a man who has a lung injury and limited patience for hair-splitting about what you've earned. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And something shifted in his expression, something I hadn't seen in a very long time. A smile. Not the almost smile from earlier in the week when he'd brought me coffee from Atlantic Avenue. Not the small acknowledgement that passed for amusement when he was being careful about showing emotion. A real smile. Genuine. The kind that started in his eyes and moved to his mouth and changed the entire shape of his face into something younger and less guarded. I'd seen that smile maybe a dozen times in 36 years. Always at unexpected moments. Never when he was trying to produce it. Just occasionally when something broke through the careful composure he wore like a second skin, it would appear for a few seconds before disappearing back behind whatever wall he kept it protected by. 4 seconds. I counted those too. 4 seconds of Noel Barnes genuinely smiling at the fact that his uncle had just handed him a maritime empire and told him not to argue about whether he deserved it. Then it was gone, back to his normal expression. Calm, steady, present. Mom would have something to say about this, he said. I knew exactly what Mireille would say. Could hear her voice like she was sitting in the back seat of this truck. She'd cry first, I said. Then she'd say I should have done it 17 years ago. She'd be right, Noel said. She usually was, I said. We sat there for another minute. 2 people in a quiet truck in a hospital parking lot on a Thursday morning in October. One of them had just been handed a fortune. The other had just corrected a mistake that had taken 17 years to fix. Neither of us needed to say anything else about it. We should get you back inside, Noel said finally. Beverly will have opinions if you miss your medication schedule. Beverly has opinions about everything, I said. She's earned them, Noel said. He got out, came around to my side, helped me stand without making anything of it. We walked back toward the hospital entrance slow because my knee still didn't appreciate speed, but steady. Through the automatic doors, across the lobby where 2 days ago Beverly had told me about Desmond's after-dinner callback, and I'd started making the phone calls that had led to this morning. To the elevator. Noel pressed the button for the 4th floor. We rode up in silence. Comfortable silence. The kind that comes from 3 decades of knowing exactly who someone is and not needing them to explain it. The elevator doors opened on the 4th floor, and my son Desmond was standing there outside room 408. Travel clothes. Expensive carry-on luggage. The kind of tan that only comes from actual beach time in actual expensive resorts. He looked like he'd come straight from the airport. Looked like a man who'd been somewhere he very much wanted to stay and had been forced to leave earlier than planned. His expression when he saw me step off that elevator was complicated. Anger underneath, calculation on top. The particular combination of emotions that comes from someone trying to figure out exactly how annoyed to appear without revealing the fear underneath. He looked at me, looked at Noel, looked at us, standing there together, like we'd just come from somewhere important. Which we had. Dad, Desmond said. I looked at him standing outside the room I'd been occupying for 3 days while he'd been in Ibiza, deciding whether cancellation policies mattered more than his father's condition. Looked at the expensive luggage, the genuine tan, the travel clothes that probably cost more than most people spent on a week's groceries. Looked at Noel standing beside me holding the folder from Clarence Webb's office that contained his copy of the new will. Desmond, I said, and I waited to see what my son thought he could say that would make any of this different. My son was standing in the 4th floor hallway outside room 408 when the elevator doors opened, and I knew from the expression on his face that he already understood his life had changed while he was in Ibiza. He was still wearing travel clothes, expensive ones, the kind that cost what most people spend on a week's rent and are designed to look casual while broadcasting exactly how much they cost. Dark jeans that fit too well to be off the rack. Button-down shirt in a color I didn't have a name for. Leather jacket that had probably been broken in by someone paid to break in leather jackets. The carry-on luggage beside him was the kind that gets gate-checked on commercial flights but hand-carried on private ones. I didn't know which kind of flight he'd taken home and didn't particularly care. His tan was real, the kind that only comes from actual beach time and actual expensive resorts where the sun hits different because you're paying for the privilege of being somewhere most people will never afford to visit. His expression was complicated. Anger underneath. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his shoulders carried tension he was trying to hide. But on top of the anger was something more calculated, the particular look of a man trying to figure out exactly how annoyed he should appear without revealing that beneath the annoyance was something that might actually be fear. He'd come home early from Ibiza. That told me everything I needed to know about how seriously he was taking this. Viveka wasn't with him. That told me she was smarter than I'd given her credit for. She'd read the situation probably from the car on the way to the airport, probably while Desmond was still trying to decide whether cancellation policies mattered more than his father's lung injury. She'd made the intelligent decision to stay somewhere else while her husband came to the hospital to have whatever conversation he thought he needed to have. Smart woman. I'd underestimated her. 3 people in a hospital hallway. One who built everything, one who earned everything, and one who believed he was owed everything. Noel stepped out of the elevator first, positioned himself slightly to my right, not blocking me, but present in a way that said he wasn't going anywhere. The folder from Clarence Webb's office was still in his hand. His expression was the same calm steadiness it had been since he'd arrived at the hospital Tuesday evening asking what I needed. I stepped out, slow because my knee still complained about sudden movements. The cast on my right wrist made balance interesting. But I made it into the hallway under my own power without needing Noel's help, which felt important, even though I couldn't have articulated exactly why. Desmond looked at me, looked at Noel, looked at the folder in Noel's hand. His expression did something I couldn't quite read, calculation layered on top of anger, layered on top of something that might have been understanding. You changed the transfer, he said. Not a question, a statement. You're changing the will. I looked at him standing there in his expensive travel clothes, with his expensive luggage, and his Ibiza tan, and his expression of someone trying very hard to appear more in control than he actually felt. The details will be with Clarence Webb Friday morning, I said. There's a letter. Read it before you call anyone or do anything else. Dad, he started. I said his name the way I say names in negotiations that matter. The way I said names to 17 people I had to fire over 31 years. Flat, final, completely devoid of the emotional cushion that might suggest there's room for argument. Desmond, I said. He stopped. The hallway went quiet. Hospital quiet, never actually silent. Just the ambient hum of medical equipment and distant conversations and the elevator mechanism settling after delivery. but quiet enough that the three of us standing there could hear each other breathe. Desmond's jaw worked like he was trying out sentences in his head before committing to saying them out loud. His eyes moved between me and Noel, calculating something, trying to figure out exactly how much he knew versus how much he was guessing. Information moves fast in Boston, I said. Always has. You've probably already talked to someone. Probably already know about the transfer freeze Tuesday morning. Probably already figured out I was at Clarence Webb's office this morning. His expression confirmed it. He'd known. Not all of it, probably, but enough. How did you find out? He asked. His voice had that particular quality of someone trying to sound casual about information they'd worked hard to acquire. Doesn't matter, I said. What matters is that the letter arrives Friday morning. What matters is that you read it before you do anything else. Before you call Viveka, before you call your lawyer, before you call anyone who's going to tell you what you want to hear instead of what you need to know. What's in the letter? Desmond asked. The truth, I said. About 9 years of $8,500 a month. About what that money was actually for. About why it stopped. He looked at Noel again. At the folder. At me. And the will, he asked. I thought about 17 pages sitting in Clarence Webb's office. Thought about 70% and 30% and 350,000. Thought about the mathematics of justice measured over 36 years. Read the letter first, I said. Everything else can wait until you've read the letter. Desmond opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Dad, he said. And I looked at him the way I look at people in every negotiation that actually matters, flat and quiet and completely immovable. The look that says the conversation is over, not because I'm angry or hurt or disappointed, but because there's simply nothing left to negotiate. Desmond, I said, and I held his eyes that way. Held them until I saw understanding start to filter through the anger and the calculation and the fear. Held them until the hallway went completely still, and even the hospital's ambient noise seemed to fade into something that felt like waiting. Then I was going to tell him what I needed to tell him, and it was going to cost both of us something. Desmond's mouth opened, and I knew exactly what was coming. The reasonable voice, the let's talk inside gesture, the attempt to move us into a room where he could manage the variables and control the outcome the way he'd done since he was 12. Dad, he said, and his voice had that particular quality of someone trying to sound concerned while actually being annoyed. Can we talk inside privately? He gestured toward room 408. The room I'd been occupying for 3 days while he'd been in Ibiza, deciding whether resort cancellation policies mattered more than his father's condition. I didn't move. We can talk here, I said. Desmond's expression shifted. Slight confusion, like I'd broken a rule of a game he'd been winning for 2 decades. He looked at Noel standing beside me at the hallway, stretching in both directions at the hospital staff moving through their routines. Here, he repeated. Here, I said. A nurse walked past, pushing a medication cart. She glanced at us 3 men standing in a hallway having the kind of conversation that radiated tension you could feel from 20 feet away. She kept moving professional enough to know that family conversations in hospital hallways were none of her business unless someone needed medical intervention. Desmond waited until she was past, then tried again. Dad, I came back early, he said. From Ibiza, I know you're upset and I understand why. The timing was it wasn't great. But Viveka and I had already paid for the trip and you were stable and the doctor said, Stop, I said. He stopped. I looked at him standing there in his expensive travel clothes with his expensive luggage and his Ibiza tan and his carefully constructed explanation for why he'd made the choices he'd made. Looked at the way he was trying to manage this conversation the same way he'd been trying to manage me for 15 years with the right words in the right order designed to make me feel like I was being unreasonable for expecting more. And I said something I hadn't planned to say. I love you, I said. Desmond stopped mid-breath. Confusion flickered across his face. He hadn't been expecting that, hadn't prepared a response for it. For maybe the first time in this conversation, he didn't know what came next. Dad, he started. I kept going. I loved you when you were 6 years old and brought me your drawings from school, I said. I loved you when you were 16 and told me the shipyard business was dying and I needed to modernize. I loved you this morning when I signed the transfer freeze at Clarence Webb's office. I love you right now standing here in this hallway. I watched something shift in his expression. Hope, maybe. The thought that this conversation was going somewhere different than he'd feared, that the love I was talking about meant forgiveness was coming next, that reconciliation was possible, that he could fix this with the right combination of apology and explanation. I looked at him, really looked at him, at the expensive watch on his wrist that had cost more than most of my employees made in a month, at the tan that came from beach time in Ibiza while his father recovered from a pipeline explosion, at the luggage at his feet that had traveled business class or better while I'd been lying in a hospital bed with damaged lungs, at the son I'd raised and loved and subsidized for 41 years, and I said the rest of it. And I'm finished paying for the privilege of your attention. Silence. 3 seconds of it. Maybe 4. Time moved differently in that hallway. The hospital sounds continued, distant beeping, someone's television playing down the hall, the elevator mechanism settling, but in the space between me and Desmond, everything went completely still. I watched the words land on his face, watched shock hit first. His eyes went wide for maybe half a second, like I'd said something in a language he didn't speak, and his brain needed time to translate it into meaning. Then anger. I knew that look. I'd been watching it for 20 years. His eyes went narrow. His jaw went tight. The muscle in his cheek twitched the way it twitched when he was working very hard not to say something he knew he'd regret later. But underneath the anger, just for half a second before he caught himself and rebuilt the wall, I saw something raw. Something that looked like hurt. Something that looked like fear. The look of someone who'd just realized that the ground they'd been standing on wasn't actually ground, that the safety net they'd been counting on had holes in it. They hadn't noticed until they were already falling through. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "What does that mean?" he asked, and his voice had lost the reasonable quality. Now it just sounded like someone trying very hard to stay in control, while everything they'd assumed about their life rearranged itself into a shape they didn't recognize. "It means exactly what it sounds like," I said. 9 years, $8,500 a month, $687,000 total. I called it support. I called it helping you get established. I called it a lot of things that sounded better than what it actually was. "Which was what?" Desmond asked. I looked at him, at my son, at the man I'd raised and loved and enabled and subsidized and made excuses for until I'd run out of excuses to make. "Payment," I said, "for your attention, for your phone calls, for your visits, for the performance of being my son instead of actually being my son." His face did something I'd never seen it do before. All the layers stripped away at once, the anger, the calculation, the careful management of how he wanted to appear. What was left underneath was something young and lost and afraid. "Dad," he said, and for the first time in maybe 20 years he sounded like he actually meant it. I stood there in that hospital hallway with my casted wrist and my damaged lungs and my nephew beside me holding a folder that contained the paperwork that would change all of our lives. And I didn't say anything else, because I'd said what I needed to say and the rest was just silence. Desmond's mouth moved like he was searching for the first word of a sentence that hadn't been written yet. He tried 3 times. I watched his lips form shapes that didn't become sounds. Watched him struggle with whatever he thought he needed to say to make this conversation go somewhere different than where it had already arrived. Nothing came out. 3 seconds passed. Maybe 4. The hospital sounds continued around us. Distant beeping elevator mechanism settling, someone's television playing down the hall. But in the space between me and my son, everything was perfectly still. I didn't soften, didn't apologize, didn't offer him an exit ramp or a way to save face or any of the 1,000 small mercies a father usually gives a son, even when the son doesn't deserve them. I just stood there and held my ground. Noel shifted slightly beside me, not toward Desmond, not away. Just a small movement that reminded both of us he was present, that this conversation had a witness, that whatever happened next was going to be remembered by someone other than the 2 people having it. "Uncle," Noel said quietly, "room's this way." He gestured toward room 408 behind Desmond. The suggestion was clear. This conversation was over time to move on. No need to prolong what had already been said. "I know where the room is," I said, but I didn't move yet. Just looked at Desmond standing there in his expensive travel clothes with his expensive luggage and his Ibiza tan and his face doing something I'd never quite seen it do before. The anger was still there. I could see it in the set of his jaw, the tightness around his eyes, the way his shoulders carried tension he was trying very hard to control. But underneath the anger, something raw was showing through, something less certain, something that looked like it might be the first honest emotion I'd seen from him in 20 years. He looked at me, looked at Noel, looked back at me, his mouth opened again, closed again. When did silence become victory? Desmond reached down and picked up his luggage, the expensive carry-on that had traveled with him to Ibiza and back, lifted it with one hand, settled the strap on his shoulder, adjusted his jacket. He didn't say anything. That was the part that struck me. Desmond Barnes, who'd been getting the last word in every argument since he was 16 years old, who'd spent 2 decades making sure he always had a response ready, who'd built an entire consulting career on being able to talk his way into or out of any situation, he didn't say anything. Just turned, walked toward the elevator, pressed the button, stood there waiting for the doors to open. First time I could remember him leaving a confrontation without getting the last word. Noel held the door to room 408 open, gestured for me to go through. I walked past him slow because my knees still protested movement careful, because balance with a casted wrist was trickier than I wanted to admit. Behind me, I heard the elevator chime, heard the doors open, heard them close again. The hallway went quiet. Beverly Cooper was in the room when I entered. She looked up from her clipboard, took one glance at my face, one glance at Noel's face, then went back to her notes without asking a single question. She'd been doing this long enough to know when a family had just finished a conversation that didn't need commentary. "Dinner in 20 minutes, she said. Her tone was brisk professional with that particular kind of kindness underneath that came from years of taking care of people at their worst. "You'll eat it this time." "Yes, ma'am," I said. She almost smiled, made another note on her clipboard, left the room without another word. I sat on the edge of the bed. Noel took the chair by the window, the same chair he'd been taking since Tuesday evening, the same position he'd held through 3 days of hospital visits and medication schedules and quiet conversations that didn't require many words. Boston Harbor stretched out beyond the window. Late October afternoon light bathed the water in that particular shade of gold that only comes in autumn in New England. The kind of light that makes everything look like it might be worth whatever it cost to get here. Morale would have loved this light, would have stood at the window and said the whole city looks like it's trying. Would have said even hard choices look holy in light like this. My phone sat on the bedside table, screen up, silent. No buzzing, no climbing numbers in the missed calls log, no voicemails accumulating like evidence of effort I hadn't asked for and didn't want. Just quiet. The earned kind. The kind that comes after you've said what needs saying and done what needs doing and stopped pretending things are other than what they actually are. I looked at Noel sitting in the chair by the window, 45 years old, weathered hands from 2 decades of shipyard work, reading glasses perched on his nose while he scrolled through something on his tablet. Probably dock schedules, probably supply orders, probably one of the 1,000 details that kept a maritime operation running smoothly. Not flashy, not brilliant, not the kind of person who made a production out of their competence or required acknowledgement for doing what needed doing. Just steady. The kind of steady that had built Harborline Marine Services in the first place, back when it was just me and a dilapidated shack and $11,000 I didn't have. The kind of steady that showed up at 5:30 every morning for 23 years without needing to be asked. The kind of steady that memorized medication schedules and brought coffee from Atlantic Avenue and sat in hospital rooms without making anything of it. The kind of steady that might keep a $40 million maritime empire running long after I was gone. I sat there on that hospital bed looking at my nephew in the afternoon light, and I understood something I'd known for a long time, but hadn't let myself think too carefully about. Harborline Marine Services had a future, just not with the son I'd spent 36 years pretending deserved it. The person who deserved it was sitting in the chair by the window with his tablet and his reading glasses, and I decided it was time to tell him about the rest of it. Hospital dinner trays gone. Boston Harbor outside the window, turning that particular shade of purple that comes right before full dark. And I told Noel there was something he needed to know. "Need to tell you something," I said. "Sit down." "I'm sitting," he said. He closed his laptop anyway, set it aside, gave me his full attention the way he'd been giving me his full attention since he was 9 years old. The hospital room was quiet except for the beep of monitors tracking vitals that were improving but not improved. I looked at the ceiling for a moment, decided where to start, then just said it. 3 piers, I said. Private holdings, Boston Harbor. Noel waited. Separate from Harborline Marine Services, I continued. Separate entities. Acquired over 15 years, kept quiet, not listed under the main company holdings. I explained it the way I'd explained business deals for 31 years, clearly, concisely, with the numbers that mattered and none of the numbers that didn't. 3 private piers in Boston Harbor, $22 million in assets, rental income from commercial vessels, berthing fees, maintenance contracts. Real money generating real revenue that went into accounts most people didn't know existed. Acquired piecemeal over 15 years. The first one in 1998, the second in 2006, the third in 2012. Each purchased through separate holding companies, each carrying different paperwork, each structured in ways that kept them off Harborline Marine Services' main balance sheet. 22 million, I said, give or take, part of the 40 million total but separate. Held differently, managed differently. You're the only one in the family who knows the full picture. Noel looked at me for 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then he said 2 words. I know. Just like that, no surprise, no questions, just acknowledgement. You know, I repeated. Known for years, he said. Been through every deal with you since I was 22. Walked every pier, signed every inspection report, all 3. I sat with that information for a moment, processed what it meant. What it said about him that he'd known about $22 million in hidden assets and had never mentioned it once. "You never said anything," I said. "Wasn't mine to say," Noel replied. "What's the difference between a secret and a responsibility?" About 20 years in the person carrying it. Desmond would have carried those peers differently, would have held them as leverage, as information to deploy at the right moment for maximum effect, as a card to play when he needed something or wanted to prove he knew more than people thought he knew. Desmond would have used them. Noel had just carried them, held the knowledge quietly because that's what the work required. Walked those peers when they needed walking, signed the reports when they needed signing, never mentioned them to anyone because the mentioning wasn't necessary and the silence was. That was the difference. That was everything. I looked at my nephew sitting in the chair by the window with the purple harbor light coming in behind him and understood something I'd probably known for a long time but hadn't let myself think about too carefully. He'd been ready for this for years, maybe decades. The only person who wasn't ready was me. "Shipyard at 5:30 tomorrow," Noel said, checking his watch. "Should get home." "Go on," I said. "I'm fine." He stood, gathered his laptop and his jacket, paused at the door, looked back, nodded once. The nod that meant he'd understood everything that had been said and everything that hadn't been said and would carry both with the same quiet competence he carried everything else. The door closed. The room went quiet. I thought about Marely, my sister. Dead 36 years, but still present in every conversation I had with her son. She used to stand at our harbor kitchen window in the mornings, watching the light come up over the water. She'd say the whole city looks like it's trying. Say it looked like everyone was doing their best, even when their best wasn't quite good enough yet. I'd tried too, just should have been sooner. Fault for delay belongs to the people who should have seen things sooner. Sometimes that fault belongs to bankers or lawyers or business partners who should have known better. Sometimes it belongs to fathers who spent 17 years writing a will that gave everything to the wrong person, because correcting it would have required admitting they'd been wrong for 17 years. That fault was mine. I accepted it, and I'd correct it while I still could. Tomorrow, Beverly said I could go home if my vitals held through the night. Blood pressure stable, oxygen levels are improving, lung function getting better day by day. Clarence Webb already had his instructions. Envelope sealed, witnessed filed. Transfer documents for the 3 private peers. Updated succession plan that gave 70% of everything to Noel and 30% to the Poor Fishermen's Relief Fund where Mireille had volunteered and where her memory deserved to be honored. Clean, final. What should have been done years ago, done now. Friday morning, that envelope would be on its way to Desmond's suburban address. Copy of the new will. Copy of the letter I'd written left-handed Tuesday night, explaining that 9 years of monthly payments hadn't been love. Everything he needed to understand that the ground he'd been standing on wasn't ground anymore. I lay there in that hospital bed thinking about tomorrow and Friday and all the days after Friday when the new reality would settle in and the old reality would become something we used to pretend was true. Thinking about Noel at the shipyard at 5:30 Friday morning doing the work that needed doing. Thinking about Harborline Marine Services and $40 million and 36 years of getting it wrong before finally getting it right. Thinking about the difference between what you owe someone and what they've earned, and how those two things aren't always the same but should be. 9:17 Friday morning courier pulled up to Desmond's suburban address with an envelope I'd never see him open, but knew every word inside. I wasn't there when it happened, didn't need to be. Clarence texted me at 9:19 2 words, no punctuation, package delivered. I set the phone face down on the hospital tray and stared at the ceiling tiles I'd memorized over 3 days. 42 full tiles in the grid above my bed, 3 half tiles along the right edge, where the room narrowed. Somewhere across Boston, my son was holding paper that would rewrite 30 years of assumptions about what he owned and what he'd inherited and what had always belonged to someone else. The envelope contained 6 pages of binding corporate actions executed while he was away. It wasn't the unprobated will. Clarence knew that sending a will to a living heir carried no legal weight. Instead, it was an immediate corporate ouster. Effective immediately, Desmond was terminated from his executive position at Harborline Marine Services for gross negligence regarding the deferred pipeline maintenance. Along with the termination, Clarence included a formal revocation of his corporate signing authority and an official eviction notice for the suburban house, which was legally held under the company's real estate portfolio. He had exactly 30 days to clear his desk and his home. Desmond would read it alone. No lawyers yet, no Viveka to soften the blow, no prepared response. just my son in his suburban kitchen with coffee going cold, learning the piers he'd renovated and branded and showcased in architectural magazines had just been reclaimed by the father he'd stopped visiting. I didn't feel victorious, didn't feel righteous. Felt like a man who'd finally stopped a bleed but couldn't get back the blood already lost. My phone stayed quiet. I'd expected that. Desmond wouldn't call. Calling meant reaction, emotion, loss of control. He'd sit with it first, calculate angles, consult someone who billed $400 an hour. The silence was its own confirmation that the message had landed. 10 o'clock, Beverly pushed through the door with a clipboard, and the expression people wear when they're professionally cheerful about something bittersweet. "Discharge paperwork," she said, setting the clipboard on the tray table. "You're officially spring from medical prison." Noel had arrived 10 minutes earlier, standing near the window with his keys already in hand, like he'd been ready to leave since Wednesday. He stepped forward when Beverly held out the pen. "You're the authorized signer," she told him, flipping to the flagged pages. "Emergency contact medical proxy discharge coordinator, initial here, and signature at the bottom." Noel signed without reading. Not carelessness, trust. He'd reviewed everything earlier in the week when we'd filled out the forms, back when discharge felt theoretical and distant. Beverly watched him sign, then looked at me. "You've got follow-up at the wound clinic Tuesday morning, 9 a.m. Noel has the address. Don't skip it. Those graphs need professional monitoring, not bathroom mirror self-assessment." "I'll be there," I said. "He'll be there," Noel echoed, pocketing the pen he'd accidentally kept. Beverly smiled, took the pen back, and collected the clipboard. She stood there a moment, not moving toward the door. 5 days of 12-hour shifts meant she'd seen me at 3 a.m. when pain broke through the medication, seen me refuse lunch because grief kills appetite, seen the 94 missed calls I never returned. "You've got people now," she said quietly. "That counts for something." I nodded, throat tight. She left without ceremony. No tearful goodbye, no life advice, no symbolic wisdom, just a nurse who'd done her job well, moving on to the next patient who needed her more. Noel handed me the canvas bag he'd brought from Peabody Place, real clothes instead of hospital cotton. Jeans that hung looser than they had in March. Button-up shirt that didn't irritate the shoulder grafts. Shoes I had to sit down to tie because bending still pulled wrong across the ribs. 10:25. I stood in the doorway of room 408 for the last time. The bed was already stripped sheets in the laundry cart tray table wiped down with antiseptic. 60 hours from now, someone else would be lying there staring at 42 ceiling tiles, counting days until discharge. Noel walked beside me down the hallway, not a head matching my pace when I slowed near the nursing station. The elevator took forever. Hospitals always felt timeless inside fluorescent perpetual noon, no windows, no seasons. But the ground floor lobby had October light coming through the glass doors, and I could see cars in the pickup lane and trees losing the last of their leaves. We walked through the automatic doors, and I stopped on the sidewalk. First time outside in 5 days. Cold air, real air. October. Boston harbor wind carrying salt and diesel, and the smell of rain coming in tonight. I filled my lungs carefully, testing the ribs, and felt the pull of healing tissue, but no sharp pain. Noel stood next to me, keys in hand, waiting. "You all right?" he asked. I looked at the street, the traffic, the skyline beyond. Somewhere in that city, Desmond was reading 6 pages that ended the silence and started something I couldn't predict. "Getting there," I said. Noel nodded toward the parking garage. "Cars on level 3. We started walking, and I realized I'd left the hospital without a wheelchair, without a nurse escort, without the insurance liability protocol I'd expected. Just walked out like a man who still had places to go. Behind us, the hospital doors slid shut. Ahead, Noel's sedan sat waiting in visitor parking, and I had no idea where we were going next. Noel's pickup smelled like diesel and old coffee and October mornings at the shipyard, and I'd never been more grateful for anything ordinary in my life. I settled into the passenger seat, slowly testing each movement, ribs first, then shoulder, then the twist to reach the seatbelt. Everything pulled, but nothing tore. Noel didn't hover, didn't offer help I didn't need. Just waited until the buckle clicked, then shifted into reverse and pulled out of the hospital parking lot. Friday mid-morning traffic moved light and easy. Harbor visible between buildings, October sun catching the water in that cold, bright way that makes everything look sharper than it is. "Straight home, or you need to stop anywhere?" Noel asked, eyes on the road. "Straight home." He nodded. We drove in silence. Familiar rhythm, no radio. Just engine noise and the hum of tires on pavement and the occasional rattle from the toolbox in the truck bed. The route home took us past Pier 9. I saw it coming before we got there. Familiar landmarks, the turn at the old cannery building, chain link fence, running along the waterfront. then the pier itself, stretching out into the harbor like it had been there forever and would stay there long after I was gone. The new high-pressure pipeline gleamed bright against the weathered dock-wood metallic surface, catching October light. Everything else looked the same: worn planks, rusted bollards, stacked shipping containers, waiting for work that never quite filled the schedule. The pipeline didn't. Fresh metal clean welds, engineered precision, replacing what should have been replaced 6 months earlier. I stared through the truck window as we passed. October light made the pipeline shine like a promise. That's where it all began. Not the explosion, not even the negligence that led to it. I started 36 years earlier, the first time I chose ease over hard truth. Mireille telling me Desmond needed boundaries, me saying he just needed time. Time became years. Years became a pattern. Pattern became the reason my son learned love looked like silence, and approval came with conditions, and family meant transactions you could walk away from when the price got inconvenient. Delayed clarity has a real price. This pier taught me that in March, when metal ruptured and pressure found flesh. Taught me again in October, when I finally stopped paying it forward and started paying it back. Where does something really begin? The moment it breaks, or the moment you first choose not to see it breaking? Noel glanced at me, once saw me staring at the pier. Didn't ask what I was thinking. Never asked. Just kept driving, eyes back on the road, hands steady on the wheel. That's trust, knowing when silence does more work than questions. The truck turned the corner. Pier 9 disappeared behind us. 10:45. Noel pulled into my driveway. Small house near the harbor. Mireille's kitchen window still facing the water, like she'd positioned it herself decades ago to catch the morning light. Probably had. He came around to the passenger side, not because I needed help, but because it was the ritual. Waited while I climbed out, slow testing balance, feet finding solid ground. Walked beside me to the front door, close enough to catch me if I stumbled, but far enough not to crowd. Inside, he got me settled in the armchair by the window, Mireille's window, the one she'd stood at every morning with coffee, watching boats and gulls and the city waking up across the water. Back tomorrow morning, Noel said, keys already in hand. Call if you need anything before then. I will. He left without ceremony. Engine started, outside tires crunching gravel, then quiet. I sat in the armchair and looked at the harbor. Same view Mireille had loved. Same October light she used to say made everything look like it was trying. 2 o'clock, the phone rang. Clarence's voice came through clear and efficient. Envelope delivered, signed for at 09:17. Anything else? I watched a gull land on the fence post outside the kitchen window. One thing. The relief fund, Mireille's name needs to appear in the records. Silence on the line, brief. Then, the charitable contribution in the will. Yes, when the fund receives it, I want her name in the source attribution. Honored benefactor memorial contribution, however they phrase it. Mireille Barnes, clear and permanent. I'll handle it personally, Clarence said. No hesitation. No questions about why. Just acknowledgement that some things matter more than legal efficiency. Thank you. Anything else? No, that's it. We hung up. I set the phone down and looked back at the harbor. The gull had left the fence post, circling now over the water, riding thermal currents with wings spread wide and motionless. Your name will be there now, I thought, where the trying counts. The poor fisherman's relief fund would get the contribution, substantial, permanent, the kind of money that bought nets and licenses and kept boats running when catch ran thin. Clarence would make sure the records showed Mireille Barnes as honored benefactor. Not me. Her. The woman who'd spent 40 years caring about people Desmond had never thought to notice. You deserve it. The harbor stretched out beyond the window, October light turning the water silver and gold. Somewhere across the city, Desmond had read 6 pages that changed everything he thought he knew about inheritance and ownership and what his father owed him. I didn't know if he'd accept it or fight it. Didn't know if the envelope would bring clarity or just sharper versions of the same old arguments. But I knew Mireille's name would be on that fund. Permanent, recognized, the legacy she'd earned and never asked for. That was enough for now. Beverly left at 5:15, tires on gravel, then nothing. Noel had gone 30 minutes before that, back to the shipyard, back to the 5:30 mornings and the dock schedules, and the 1,000 small details that kept a $40 million maritime operation moving without ceremony or applause. Same as always. Just his name on the paperwork now. The house settled around me the way houses do when they've been empty 3 days and suddenly aren't. I walked from the entryway to the kitchen to the living room, not because I needed anything in those rooms, but because I needed to remember what it felt like to move through a space that was mine. Mireille's armchair faced west, angled, so the afternoon light came in over the left shoulder and the harbor stretched straight ahead. She'd positioned it herself the October we moved in. Said you should always know which direction the water is. Said people who couldn't find the water didn't know where they were. I sat down carefully. Ribs still negotiated every movement. The phone on the side table had been quiet all afternoon. I'd expected calls, lawyers, Viveka, friends of Desmond's trying to confirm what they thought they knew. The silence meant either he was still reading, still processing, or he'd already decided on a response he wasn't ready to deliver yet. Either way, I was done waiting for it. That's the part nobody tells you about the end of something long and difficult, how ordinary the silence feels, how the quietest moments come after everything that needed saying has been said, and what remains is just the harbor and the chair and the light going down over the water exactly as it did the evening before. 5 days since the pipeline blew. 4 days since 94 missed calls glowed on a screen I refused to answer. 3 days since Noel walked through a hospital door covered in coal dust and asked 4 words that cost him nothing and settled everything. 2 hours in Clarence Webb's office, 17 pages, blue ink, done. A letter sitting in a house across the city. That wasn't mine to carry anymore. What was mine, this window? The harbor going silver, then gray, then dark as dock lights came up along the waterfront, reliable as tides, indifferent to whatever had been decided or corrected above them. Harborline Marine Services was in the right hands. The piers were in the right hands. The company Murray had believed in before it was worth believing in would continue, because the person running it had learned its value from the ground up, one inspection walk at a time, the way everything real is learned. The dock lights held. I stayed in the chair. And to you listening to my story, remember this family betrayal. Revenge doesn't come from anger. It comes from finally choosing what's right. I spent 36 years rewarding absence and ignoring presence. Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until you're 68 and lying in a hospital bed to see which people in your life actually show up. Don't let blood excuse behavior that loyalty would never tolerate. I wish I'd seen it sooner. I wish Morelli had lived to see me finally get it right. The lesson from family betrayal revenge stories like mine is simple. People show you who they are through their actions, not their words. 94 missed calls mean nothing compared to one person sitting in a hospital chair for 3 days straight. I believe God puts us through trials to finally open our eyes to what we've been refusing to see. Sometimes the hardest truth is realizing the family you built isn't the family you thought you had. And sometimes fixing that even late is the only way forward. Stories of family betrayal revenge aren't about punishment. They're about correction. If you've heard family Reddit stories about betrayal and found yourself in mine, leave a comment below and tell me, did I do the right thing? Would you have made the same choice? Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if stories like these real family Reddit stories about hard choices and harder truths matter to you, subscribe to Dad's Silent Revenge. You're not alone in this. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. One last note, this story contains fictionalized elements for storytelling purposes, but the message, the lesson about recognizing true loyalty, that's real, and I hope it stays with you.